Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for another Zoom edition of ODI Fridays. My name is James and I'm a consultant at the Open Data Institute, or the ODI. Our guest speaker today is Kevin Gosling. Kevin is the Chief Executive of Collections Trust, an organisation which helps museums capture and share information that gives their objects meaning. Today's lecture will explore how tapping into the resources siloed in the databases of 1,700 UK museums can help the sector survive and thrive, particularly in the current difficulties that we face today. Before handing over to Kevin, can I please ask that all participants make sure that you have your microphones on mute and cameras turned off during the presentation. You will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you do want to ask something, then please make sure to submit your questions using the chat function. And then after the presentation, I'll ask people one by one to either unmute and ask their question, or if I hear silence for a few seconds, then I'll ask it myself. I'd also like to remind you that we're recording this session as well. So once again, thank you for joining us today. And now I'll hand over to Kevin.
Thank you, James. Can you see the slides okay?
Not yet.
No, let's just... Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this. As James said, I'm from an organisation called Collections Trust. If you haven't come across us before, we are grant funded by Arts Council England, and our mission is, as James said, to help museums capture and share information that gives their objects meaning. And we're currently been working on an ODI supported project, which is really focusing on how we might do some of that capturing and sharing a little bit better. So I'm going to start with a dinosaur footprint. Who doesn't love a dinosaur footprint? It's a really great picture, and I found it online at the website of York Museums and Gallery Trust. And they've very kindly made it available with a nice open Creative Commons license, so I could download it and show it to you. So I found this image on the Trust's website. So they've got pretty much their whole collection catalogue on their own website. And there's a bit more information about that particular specimen. And it turns out they've actually got not just one, but 42 specimens that have dinosaur footprints. Some of them have got images, which is really great if you're a teacher or a picture researcher, and others are just the records, but that's still great. You know, if you're a paleontologist and you're working on a project involving dinosaur footprints, that's a great place for you to look. Now, the Yorkshire Museum is a venerable institution dating back to 1830, like a lot of our great civic museums, you know, founded by the Victorians. Here's a picture of it in the early 1900s, and I found this image on Wikimedia, where the Trust had uploaded it, perhaps during a few months when they had a Wikipedian in residence working at the museum. So far, so open. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Well, it's the same problem that a chap called Henry Plattmauer was trying to solve back in 1888. That's right, 1888. So he was the keeper, the curator of the Yorkshire Museum, and he had this idea that it would be really useful to be able to bring together what he called a compendious index of all the contents of regional museums. So he called a meeting, and that meeting did have a positive result. It resulted in the Museums Association, which is still going strong and doing great work. But unfortunately, the idea of having a compendious index didn't come to anything. Now, Henry Plattmauer was a geologist, so he's exactly the sort of person who would want to know about all of the dinosaur footprints in all of the museums around the country, if not these days, the world. So if he were around today, what with the World Wide Web and everything, he would probably hope to be able to do a fairly easy search and find all of those specimens. Sadly, he would be disappointed. So if we type dinosaur footprints in UK museums into a well-known search engine, we get 1.3 million results. And by page 2, I'm bored of looking already. But this has caught my eye. Scarborough Museums, okay, Yorkshire coast is probably a good place to find dinosaur footprints. They say they've got some, so let's have a look and see what Scarborough Museum have got. Okay, there's a snag. So the museum is working on putting their collections data onto their website, but they haven't yet. So I'm not in any way having a dig at Scarborough Museum. There are many, many museums that don't, because actually it's quite a difficult thing to do. So if you're building a website, it's often the most costly part of that project. And the scant research that we've got suggests that in many cases, the online collections bit of a museum website is the least visited. And it often has quite a poor user experience, which kind of compounds the problem. So at the start of lockdown back in April, we did a quick survey and we heard back from 265 UK museums, and more than a third of them couldn't access their own data online from home. So never mind sharing their data with anybody else. The staff and the volunteers who were furloughed or working from home just could not even see their collections data. So it's a big problem. But what if there were a way to actually publish data about, say, fossils on somebody else's site? You know, wouldn't it be great if you could just search across all of the natural history collections, not only in this country, but around the world? Well, such an infrastructure exists, and this is what it looks like. It's called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and it's really the infrastructure of an entire scientific endeavor around the world, which is mainly around recording observations of living organisms, so biological records, but also includes a lot of data on specimens from museum collections. Now, the Natural History Museum in London, they've got a lot of their stuff in there, and a handful of other larger UK museums have also got content in there. But there are many, many more museums, including the Yorkshire Museum and most of the other big civic collections, that just have not been able to get their data into GBIF for whatever reason. And it's not particularly hard to get your data in there, but also it's not particularly easy either. So it's a faff that museums just haven't got over. It's a barrier to participating, that you've got to format your data into a certain way. You have to export it in order for it to then be ingested by this existing infrastructure. It's just not worth it for the museum, even with important specimens like type specimens. So here is another example of something that's in the Yorkshire Museum. It's an unpronounceable ichthyosaur, a particular species, but it's the type specimen for that species, which means that it's the reference specimen. So if anybody thinks or wants to compare bones against this species, this is the specimen that they would actually come and look at in order to do that research. So type specimens are a big deal within the world of taxonomy, and UK museums have got a lot of them. But even those really important specimens are not in the global biodiversity information facility when they easily could be. Now, if you think that naming long dead dinosaurs is a little bit niche, well, there are uses of natural history collections that are much more topical, including research into the impact of climate change on biodiversity. The Royal Society last year published an issue of its journal on this very topic. So it turns out that natural history collections, going back in some cases a couple of hundred years, contain really useful information for all kinds of research looking at the long-term impacts of climate change on particular species. So again, there's a kind of huge potential scientific benefit to sharing this data, but it's just beyond the capacity of most of our museums, and they need help. Here's another site which also brings together information about lots of different collections. And in this case, it's a really good example of a site that actually gives a lot back to the participating museums. So part of the problem with the natural history collections is, apart from the greater good of science, there isn't much that comes back to the institution themselves. Whereas in the case of Art UK, they're providing a really compelling package of services that really make it worthwhile museums taking part. So here, for example, this is an image from Leicester Museum of the walkway just outside the museum. And Leicester is one of those big civic museums that just doesn't have the resources to put its own collections online, but at least its art collection is available to the wider public through the Art UK site. So they've taken the data. In some cases, they've even taken the photos. They've sorted out copyright issues where those exist, and they presented the data in a really nice website that is widely used by the general public. There's more. There's also a feature on the site which is for crowdsourcing added information and enriched information about objects called Art Detective. There's a tool called Curations, which allows anybody, including the museums or just any user of the site, to create their own curated online exhibition. Really useful tool, particularly for those museums that have limited functionality on their own websites. And there's even a shop. So the Art UK people have done an enormous amount of work sorting out the licensing and the online sort of retail operation and fulfillment that then allows participating museums to actually earn money from sales of items that are on the website. And if you are looking for unusual Christmas presents, it's a really good place to look. So I commend it to you if you're stuck for inspiration. They're about to launch a learning area of the site with lots of resources aimed at teachers and pupils, all geared to particular curriculum topics in the 4 home nations of the UK. So it's a really good, strong offer that would be beyond the reach of all but the very largest museums. And it's all made possible because an organisation has used economies of scale, bringing together all of the data about all of the oil paintings and soon all of the sculptures in the UK to present them. So it's a really, really good case study. And yet, even a site as sophisticated as Art UK still struggles to get the raw material into its site. So the data and the images from 1,700 museums around the country, getting them onto the Art UK site and then updating those records once they're there, if something changes at the museum end, is quite difficult. Spreadsheets are involved. And it's exactly the same with Google Arts and Culture, Wikipedia, GBIF, and many other platforms. So whether you're an individual researcher trying to track down dinosaur tracks, or a flagship platform for aggregating and publishing collections data, you're up against the same problem, just getting hold of the data from 1,700 museums, most of which have got very limited technical capacity. In fact, I've started using this analogy, which is kind of, I think, helps to explain the problem that we're trying to solve in our ODI project. So if you are trying to get information out of UK museums, really for any reason whatsoever, it's a little bit like having to kind of pick up your bucket and walk miles to fetch water, and then carry it back to wherever you want to use it and tip it in, and possibly have to clean it, and the whole thing just takes forever. And individual researchers, museum staff, and museum volunteers are just spending inordinate amounts of every single day just trying to find information for various reasons that ought to be at their fingertips and could easily be at their fingertips, and yet just isn't. Why does this matter? Well, as I've already mentioned, in lockdown, museum people themselves couldn't carry on working because they couldn't get access to their data, but also it suddenly became really, really important to hold on to existing audiences and to try and build online audiences at a time when museums themselves were, and many still are, physically closed. And we just don't have the workflows to do this efficiently. So we are still essentially handcrafting what looks superficially quite slick, but a lot of museum digital content that is created is done in a very, very laborious, handcrafted way. So we can do better than that. There are other drivers as well. So one of the big things that's happened this year, which is presenting a big strategic challenge to the sector, is Black Lives Matter and the resulting sort of really focus on an issue that's been with us for many decades, in fact, but has sort of come to a head around repatriation, around research into material acquired in the colonial era. And of course, if you are someone who is interested in material from a particular part of the world, the first question you have is, well, what material is there in UK museums? The Guardian last autumn was reduced to actually putting out a call to its readers to ask them to help track down Benin bronzes in UK museums. And even well-funded programs such as those funded by the Australian government to do research have found it just very, very time-consuming and challenging to get information which is just sitting in the siloed databases of hundreds of museums around the UK. So this is a problem that isn't going away, and we just don't have the ability to pull together information in the way that we need to. And the other thing that we're not very good at, considering we're so good at keeping physical objects, as a sector, museums are not very good at keeping digital content. And this is just a comment that the DCMS Select Committee made when they reviewed the recent First World War centenaries. So literally millions of pounds went into creating a lot of digital content for that centenary, and there was no archiving plan for it. So there was a scramble after the event to try and archive this content so that it could be preserved for the future. And the DCMS Select Committee made the not unreasonable point that digital assets that are publicly funded perhaps ought to come with some kind of strategy for keeping them in the long term. And at the moment, there is no strategy. We continue to spend a lot of grant funding creating, digitizing collections, creating projects, creating content that just don't have any kind of long-term life. So they're treated almost as ephemeral digital content rather than assets that are created that ought to be saved and used in the future. So there are really compelling reasons why, particularly now when there is even less money in our sector than there was before, we just really need to up our game and be a lot more efficient with the way we use data. So this ODI project has just been a real opportunity for us to just sort of sit back and reflect and research what we could do differently as a sector. So we're here, this is where we are now, but at the same time, there's a lot of spending going on things which are quite flashy and more exciting. These are the fountains at Versailles, where, of course, in order to get the water, they had to rather laboriously divert a river. And we just need to sort of think about how we could do this a little bit more efficiently. So one of the things that I think we're coming to the view we need, and we're still kind of working on this project, so this is kind of early days, but we want to start putting ideas out for consultation and flying some kites, is that we need a dedicated museum data service, which is not, by the way, Collections Trust. We're not trying to build our part up in this. We think it needs to be, it needs to live with an institution with the kind of the heft to, and the capacity to really carry it forward for the long term. So we're not talking about any kind of pilot or demonstrator. This is something that just needs to be set up for the long term. And the sort of things that it would do would be actually quite simple, unlike many of the other aggregators we've looked at around the world. So it would actually limit itself as a core service to harvesting data from UK museums, but in a very neutral way. So not requiring the museums to format their data to any particular metadata schema or to provide it in through any particular route. So however a museum could supply its data, that would be fine. And the aggregator would hold copies of that data without trying to shoehorn it at this stage into any particular schema. So it's preserving the richness of the source data, which can be lost through mapping processes and harvesting processes, as we've seen in other aggregators. So where a museum hasn't been able to publish its data in a kind of machine readable, useful way, then the Museum Data Service would do that. And as they do in countries like Sweden, the data service would also mint the persistent URIs that would just guarantee, insofar as it's possible, that those records would be usable for the long term. It would also provide a search and select tool, but not as really a kind of something for the general public. It's not a sort of, it's not intended to be any kind of fancy portal. It's a tool for researchers and curators to find what they need and to be able to select what they need, and then either download that data or through an API, send it on to wherever it's going to go for whatever happens next. And again, the Museum Data Service is entirely agnostic about what happens next. It's just providing access to that data. And then the other problem that I mentioned of kind of digital preservation of content that's created, we think that there's scope for this service to also be the home for mappings of data and other enhancements that might happen outside and beyond the data service, but are nonetheless relevant to the data that it holds and might otherwise be lost. So for example, if one of the subject specialist networks that we have were to do a particular project where they're looking at a particular kind of collection across, say, a region's museum, what often happens time and again is that that project finishes and then the data is lost along with the knowledge and expertise that went into creating it. And we don't currently have a home for that kind of data. So we think that the Museum Data Service could provide that home for those kind of enrichments and enhancements that happen to the source records, but which otherwise would just be lost. So that would be the kind of the core service. And that feels like the kind of minimum viable service that could be core funded. And I don't think it would cost a huge amount to do it, because often the expensive bit in running this kind of aggregator is doing all of the mapping and all the rest of it, which in, I think, our emerging model could happen through a project funded way. So there would be other projects, other funding would come in for particular projects that would look at, say, for example, taking the natural history records that were there, mapping them to Darwin Core so that they could go off into GBIF, and that would be kind of a funded project which could begin and end, and then there would be a digital legacy to that. But that wouldn't be part of the core service, wouldn't need to be provided by the Museum Data Service. It could be done in partnership with all sorts of other people. And similarly, there would be a whole network, a whole ecosystem of tools and services that would help museums to actually work together and improve their productivity, such as, I mean, let's say, a kind of exhibition text writing tool where you can see your own records and those of museums you're collaborating with. You can collaborate together on writing text for a particular exhibition or an online project. And as a result of that, you've got your content, which goes off to the end product, but you can then also save that content in a databasey way for future reuse. And it's all linked back to the original source records. That kind of tool would instantly transform our capacity to hang on to the knowledge that's created in our everyday work, which at the moment tends to just end up in spreadsheets and Word documents that never then see the light of day. So there are all sorts of services that we think would really add value if the enabling service existed in the first place. And so we want to get from here, which is where we are now, to the situation where the information from 1,700 museums around the country is available on tap to whoever needs it for whatever purpose, including the big ticket items, the big projects that are currently being funded, which are otherwise not particularly sustainable, but they would be if they were hooked into the kind of data service that we're talking about. So that's sort of where we're up to with our project. These are emerging thoughts. We plan to start loading up some of the thinking that's coming out of our project onto our website, collectionstrust.org.uk, over the coming weeks. So do sign up to our newsletter or our social media channels for kind of updates on that. And then we want to really open these ideas up to the wider museum sector and beyond, to just get our stakeholders to try and build a consensus around what needs to happen and a plan for taking it forward. So that's all I wanted to say for now. I'm really happy to take questions, and thank you for listening. And
Great.
stop there. There we go.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really interesting, and we have got a few questions starting to pop up in the chat.
Okay.
As I said before, I will ask people if they want to unmute and ask their questions, and if you take longer than a few seconds, then I'll do it just to make sure that we push things along. So firstly, we've got a question from Kim Team. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Kevin. It's actually Jonathan at the Horniman Museum.
Oh, hi, Jonathan. Hi.
Changed my name. Hi there. So my question came before you explained how you planned to bring order to the to the data, but it was around what search function you thought might be possible if the data comes in multiple formats, in multiple structures. But I guess you actually answered that question, and you said that people were going to start to bring order to it as secondary projects, that you saw it as just your first step was getting it together. And I would agree that's a very important first step.
Yeah, and I think that where other aggregators have come unstuck is that by imposing a particular metadata schema, you end up shoehorning the data in. So you're actually losing some of the richness of the original. And so what I think would be really helpful is if the service that we would be providing would be to simply publish a machine readable online version of source records, with then not ourselves making any assumptions about how anybody else would want to use it. So for example, I mean, the Arts and Humanities Research Council is currently spending 19 million pounds on a series of really exciting research projects. And people on those projects will come up with all kinds of strategies and ways that they'll want to experiment with for using the data. And if we've taken some arbitrary decisions about how to process the data on the way in, that would then possibly foreclose some strategies that they might want to experiment with. So I think the principle of taking the data in and holding it there so that anybody else can do anything else that they want with it is probably a good one and future-proofed.
Thank you.
We have a question from Neil Burston.
Does Jonathan want to come back in there? I think he...
No, it's okay. Thanks. That was a really good answer.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, just fascinating. It sounds like it's exactly the sort of thing we're looking to tap into from Historic England's point of view. And just wondered, you mentioned there were some tools to help make this more achievable, because I just wondered what they might be and how we can get to use them.
Yeah, well, they don't currently exist. So this is the point, that there are things that could easily exist, or they've sort of, I mean, various Europeana projects, for example, have started to create these kind of tools, and they've never really kind of been developed further. But if you had the basic capacity to find records that you want, and then to save them and then send them off to somewhere else, you could then have these kind of tools, which are basically variants on, I would like to annotate this data in some way, and I would like to save those annotations as records that are linked back to the objects through the unique object number, in the same way that we can link other kinds of digital assets, such as images, back to object records. We can do that with chunks of text that are created. And there could be all sorts of applications that could be developed by commercial developers, by open source projects that would just respond to particular needs and develop an app to do that thing. So doing collection reviews, for example. So you've got a curator who's going out to lots of different museums, and they're wanting to record information about particular objects. If they could have access to the object records through this aggregated data, they can then type away the sort of thing that they would normally put into an Excel spreadsheet. But at the end of the day, that information can then be brought back into the Museum Data Service and held, rather than just gathering digital dust. So the tools don't exist. We need the kind of the aggregator first. I did have some interesting conversations actually with your Swedish counterparts. So the Swedish National Heritage Board were one of the people that we talked to as part of our ODI project. And they too have been thinking, wouldn't it be useful to have these kind of tools? And since they already have the aggregator, we did, start to say, well, actually, maybe we should start thinking about developing some of this stuff, and we could use your aggregation and your aggregated data to demonstrate the principles before we in the UK actually have that capacity.
Maybe just a supplemental question: is there like a working party working on that within the ODI? And forgive me for not knowing that. It's kind of relatively new to.
Oh, so this so I think this would be the kind of project that would need stakeholders from across the sector to take forward. So the way I imagine it would work would be there would be a host institution that would kind of take this on, but there would need to be at least an advisory group, if not something more formal, that would draw on stakeholders from across the whole sector that would really kind of guide the principles behind this. So we started to draft some principles that we think would be useful, and we'll start to put those on the website. And would the central service could help broker those kind of projects with whoever wanted to bring them forward. So I think there certainly wouldn't be a monopoly on developing these. The idea would be to provide the basic functionality and then let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Great. We have a question from Megan S, who can't unmute, which says, have technologies like IIIF used heavily for medieval manuscripts been looked at?
Yeah, yes, indeed. And in fact, I mentioned these AHRC projects under a program called Towards a National Collection. And there is one that's based at the National Gallery that is looking exactly at how we might use IIIF. And the vision that I would have would be if, for example, the Museum's Data Service acted as a trusted digital repository for images as well as object records, then you could add in things like IIIF server, and you could bring the functionality of IIIF to small museums who would then be able to do things like produce crops of their images without knowing anything about IIIF or how it worked. They just wouldn't care. They'd just have a tool that would allow them to have a very big, high resolution TIFF file somewhere up in their digital store, and they would simply be able to produce whatever crop they wanted and embed that into whatever online product they were working on. So I think there are kind of potentially huge benefits, but at the moment it's the big institutions with the technical capacity that are exploring them. And I think there is absolutely no reason why the sector couldn't organize things so that without knowing anything about the technology or how it worked, we couldn't give some of the benefits of it even to the smallest volunteer-run museum.
Great, thank you. Rupert, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Kevin, thanks. Hi. It's really a follow-up to Jonathan's question. Given that the data's stored in its kind of source formats and there's an API that queries it, a unified query really needs unified vocabularies. I mean, I'm thinking of a museum that shall remain nameless, where if you wanted to search for copper alloy objects, you had to search variously for bronze, for copper alloy, for CUA, for CU space A, and that was in one museum.
Yeah.
If putting this across 1,500 museums, how do you address that problem before the kind of the data is wrangled into standard formats? You still need that for the search to work.
Yeah, and I think that the search engine would need to have access to those kind of vocabularies. So I think as part of the kind of the overall service, you would start to build up connections and those kind of AI sort of pathways that would allow you to suggest the authority proper terms from authority files, for example, and would give you access to synonyms and preferred terms and non-preferred terms. So I think that the search engine would need to be hooked up to kind of semantic resources that are out there. And I think I'm really hoping that some of these towards a national collection projects start to really kind of dig deeper into how we can do that. So how can we actually, harness these controlled vocabularies and other semantic resources that we've got and put them to work on big data sets. And I think that's a really interesting research question, and provided the Museum Data Service is set up in a very agnostic and flexible and modular way, then as services are developed and pipelines are developed, it would then be able to take advantage of them.
So you see this as being one of those sort of augmenting services, possibly coming out of a research project, that it won't be part of the sort of native core thing. It's something that has to be added on.
I think so, yeah, and I think that feels realistic to do, and I'm kind of very conscious that this is something that will have to be as skinny as possible in terms of and as fleet of foot as possible to stay funded over the long haul.
Yeah.
And so the more that we can put into projects where there is funding. I mean, there's squillions going on in this kind of activity around the world at the moment. And what we just need to be able to do is to connect with it. We don't have to do it all ourselves. So I think we just need to structure things so that we would be able to take advantage of the research that's happening, not just within the museum sector or cultural heritage, but the wider digital humanities and other disciplines. And where needed, it would act as a repository for some of that, and where that other content existed as linked data, it would link to it.
Great, thanks.
Great. We have a question from Aruna.
Yep. Hi, Aruna.
Hello. Nice. Thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. Yeah, my question was just, again, quite a practical one, but thoughts around version control.
Yes. So I'm kind of not an expert in this at all. So I'm kind of going back to work. We did a technical feasibility study last year with Knowledge Integration, who do the middleware that a lot of you use, and their thinking, which I think sounds very sensible, is that you would keep any annotations that came in from either AI or as a result of kind of human intervention, that they would be clearly identified and wouldn't overwrite any of the source record. And as part of the service that would be provided, you would want there to be a tool that would allow museums to kind of accept, in a sort of semi-automated way, annotations and enhancements that came back in, so that they would have the option to improve their own record, but they wouldn't have to. So what I'm thinking, so for example, there was a story in the paper a couple of weeks ago about a PhD student who went to the Booth Museum in Brighton and figured out that what had been documented as a shark's fin was actually part of a pterodactyl jawbone or something like that. Anyway, so new information has come in, which because actually this is in a peer-reviewed paper, is probably better than the information the museum has got. So that would, the museum would then have the opportunity to say, yeah, actually, do you know what? Let's update our record. So you would have this kind of virtuous circle where data is coming from the museum into the aggregator. It's being worked on, it's being enhanced. The museum then has the opportunity to actually take some of those enhancements back into, back to the ranch, to the home, collections management system, at which point, an updated version of the record then gets aggregated back in. So you have this kind of possibility for an iterative process, but at no point is anybody's own data being overwritten without their permission, and all annotations are held and clearly identified as to where they come from and why they're there.
And just a follow-up question to that. So I'm just thinking of a current challenge we face, because we work quite heavily with Art UK, as well as there's a risk there if a museum hands over its data and the data then is in somewhere else. It's not a live feed necessarily, and there's work happening within the institution itself, so their own CMS is being updated in tandem, say potentially with these external annotations. So do you sort of perceive it being a live feed to some extent? It would be kind of an API link, or would you need some sort of, we'd have to sort of lock our data, so to speak, once it was sent over, to allow for that virtual, that circle that you've described to sort of work?
Yes, and I don't know if you saw, so Andy Ellis and Adrian Cooper gave a talk at our conference, which is still on our website, about the plans that they've got for a data harvester for Art UK. So they are kind of very, very alive to that problem, and I think have really good proposals to deal with it if they get to build their data harvester.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. I think that is all of the questions. So all that's left is to give a big thank you to Kevin for a wonderful presentation and some really comprehensive answers to the questions as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you
for great questions and the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for joining us today. Just a heads up, our next Friday lunchtime lecture will be by Sophie Walker, who is the COO and co-founder of Disposal, which are another organisation that the ODI is supporting as part of our stimulus fund. And they really focus on connecting waste producers with licensed waste companies to try and manage some of the complexities around compliance. So please do join us next week for that session. Otherwise, have a great Friday afternoon and a great weekend.
Great. Thank you.